Good morning. I'm so used to saying good afternoon recently. Welcome to another live broadcast of the Connected Leadership Podcast. What a great way to kickstart your weekend a little bit early. I thank you very much for joining me. If you are on the call on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on YouTube, please use the comments, say hello so that I know you're out there. And throughout the call, please feel free to come in with your own thoughts, your own feedback, and any questions you may have for myself or my guest. If you haven't joined me before, welcome. I'm Andy Lapata. I host the Connected Leadership Podcast, which goes out every week on a Monday and a Thursday. So this is a pre-record for an interview that will go out in May. On the Monday, we have a general interview around 45 minutes long on different themes based around the premise that professional relationships underpin executive success. We predominantly aim towards leaders and aspiring leaders, but of course everyone is welcome if you find the content interesting. On the Thursday, we have a 15-minute or so conversation with the same guest on the role of professional relationships in their career, and we ask them about the books, the podcasts, the TED Talks and more that have inspired them along the way. So that's what you can expect from today. We're going to cover both interviews in the same broadcast. And my guest today is probably one of my closest and oldest friends in the world of speaking and writing. He is a very successful author and speaker, incredibly busy, incredibly popular all over the world, and his books have sold and generated a huge response wherever he's been. In fact, if you remember the days when you could go to an airport, you wouldn't find an airport bookshop without a whole row of his books. He's probably best known as the Sumo Guy for Sumo, Shut Up, Move On. But he's written a range of other books, including, I have next to me here, How to Have a Great Life. He's written How Not to Worry, Self-Confidence, and many more. You might be spotting a bit of a theme here. And his new book comes out in June, and it's called The Happiness Revolution, co-authored with Dr. Andy H.A.P.P.Y. I've had the privilege of having a preview, and it's a familiar blend of very insightful ideas, very important reflections on how we operate as human beings, but wrapped up in quite irreverent humour. And I think that sums up the man himself. So let me welcome my good friend, Paul McGee. Paul, welcome to the Connected Leadership Podcast.
Andy, it's great to be with you, and I've finally found my strap line: irreverent humour. I am from Manchester, and often I'm known as the motivational speaker. And I always say to people, and no offence to my Californian friends that may be tuning in, but I say you're not going to get Californian motivation from me. I'm from Manchester. It's Mancunian. No bull. Tell it as it is, and let's be practical. Now, I might also add with a bit of irreverent humour along the way as well. Anyway, but it's great to be with you, Andy. It really is.
That's it, great. And of course, as a Wigan fan, and I can say this as a Charlton fan, you have to have a sense of humour just to get through as well, don't you?
It certainly helps. And I've got me affections for Bradford City as well.
Yeah.
So it's been an interesting 12 months. Never mind the global pandemic we've all been going through.
And we share a painful liking for Aberdeen as well, and this is an Aberdeen top underneath. Underneath.
Oh, is it? Good on you, mate. Good on you.
Right, so Paul, let's get into it. The book is called The Happiness Revolution. Of course, happiness it's a topic that's been bubbling around for a while, thanks to David Cameron and his Big Society, and looking, there's a lot of surveys and research and stories about what makes us happy. And of course, over the last year, our happiness has perhaps been called into question more than ever. I want to come to that in a second. But aside from all of that, the last 10, 20 years has seen probably more accelerated technological progress than any time in our lives, and certainly any time in history. So much has changed, and so much of it is designed around our leisure time rather than our work time. So are we happier now than in the past?
It's a great question. And I think that the thing is, I find the whole flipping subject, and I've obviously co-authored this book on happiness, but even trying to define the word and what it means to people is pretty hard. So when you say, are we happier? I feel at times like that subject, it's like I'm wrestling with a flipping fish and it's hard to pin it down. I mean, you go back to 1966. Not only did England win the World Cup that year, not only was I a 2-year-old toddler who had finally been potty trained, but there was an advert that came out by Hamlet, and it was called not the guy from Shakespeare, but the cigars. It was happiness is a cigar called Hamlet.
Yeah, I remember.
And if the subject was just as so easy as that, so it's actually shown on TV for 25 years. And if you Google it or go on YouTube, some brilliant adverts. But when you say, are we happier? Happiness is a cigar called Hamlet. It's like that's it in a nutshell, but it's a huge topic, isn't it? It's like when Eskimos talk about snow, they've got different words for it. It's when you talk about you love Charlton Athletic and I love Wigan Athletic and I love my wife and I love Marmite. And it's like, hang on a minute, we're using the same word to describe a lot of things. So in some respects, are we happier? I think if our grandparents had been told what the world would look like now, and all the potential, you'll have more leisure time, technology will make life a lot easier for you, we'll have all these own creature comforts and you'll have more choice and more options, then they would probably have said, well, in that case, we will be happier. And yet I think it's fair to say, isn't it, Andy, that with all those, the choices, the options, the creature comforts, life being easier, the advancement of technology, the reality is actually, are we any happier? Hard to define at times. And I think many people would probably say, no, they're not.
So we got a couple of comments from Andrew Bryant in Singapore, who's watching on Facebook. He started off by saying that happiness is a non-construct. And then followed up by saying the Hamlet ad showed Schadenfreude, not happiness. So happiness is a non-construct. What does that mean to you, Paul?
Well, I think you're best asking Andrew. Yeah. I mean, I'm a professor, but I'm only a visiting professor at the University of Chester, and I don't visit very much. And I talk about common sense, but what I think it is, it's hard to define. It is a non-construct. It means different things to different people. And for me, happiness is a byproduct of living life well. I don't think it's a goal in itself, but actually most people say, I want to be happy. And then when you ask them, so what does that look like? And they'll sometimes say, well, I don't have any problems. But then you realize it's a bit like playing the game, the game of life. I talk about, snakes and ladders. And if you think about it for a moment, if you were playing that game of snakes and ladders, but there weren't any snakes on the board, in other words, there weren't any potential challenges or threats and setbacks that could happen during the game, well, for a start, you wouldn't call it snakes and ladders, you just call it ladders and ladders. But you know what, Andy? The game would be really boring. And in fact, at times people think that, happiness is about problem-free, things going great. And actually, at times, it's that ability to have landed on a snake, metaphorically speaking, in life, and actually, overcome that and grow through that experience and become maybe a bit wiser and a bit more self-aware as a result. So I think this whole thing that Andrew's mentioned about this non-construct, I think I understand that. It's a byproduct. It's not a goal in itself.
Yeah.
It's what happens. It's almost like the residue that occurs after you've done something else. And I think we often think it is about having a smile on your face and it's problem free. And actually, some of the most fulfilling moments in our lives come as a result of the struggles that we've had and that we've actually come through.
Well, okay, so the last 15 months have probably been the biggest snake on the board of most of our lives over the last 50, 60 years, or more, probably going back to the Second World War for many people. Has it affected our happiness in the short term? And do you think, going back to what you've said, is it going to help us in the longer term in how we adapt and how we see life as a result of what we've been through over the last year or so?
I think, again, big topic, isn't it? And in fact, it almost depends on who you talk to. because I've got a friend of mine, also called Paul, who is not the most extrovert of people, who hates having to socialize, who hates the whole concept of small talk. So if you look at the last 15 months for him, he's been able to have the time to do all these walks. He's not had to interact with as many people. And in fact, he would probably say, I'm happier than I was pre-pandemic. Now, is he an outlier? Well, he might be, but I think there's a few people who would be in that bracket who would say, I spend more time with my family. I don't have to commute. And maybe they live in a context where they've got a number of family members. So it's not like they felt isolated. They've had more time to do all sorts of other different things with their lives. So you've got that at one end of the spectrum, haven't you? But then you've got at the other end of the spectrum, people who have felt isolated, who have lived with this underlying anxiety all the time about the virus. Now it's impacting them and other people. And if you read or watch any TED talk or read any of the literature, I think one of the things that people would agree with, and there is some disagreement about, well, what is happiness and what makes us happy? But what does seem to be the case is connection is important, which is fairly good for you, really, on the connect, when you think about your whole concept around connection. And humans need humans. But again, there's a spectrum to all of this. So my mate Paul doesn't need as much social interaction and engagement with people as I do. For me, I find social media can be a blessing and it can be a curse, but it can actually be a blessing as well. So I think just as the topic itself can be quite subjective, asking, how's it affected our happiness levels? Well, I'm working a lot within the NHS, and they would certainly say there's been an upturn and an uprise in terms of people who would use the term mental health issues and challenges. My son is a trainee GP, and although it's a significant rise in percentage terms, fortunately not in numbers, but he would have seen in the last 6 weeks, particularly as children were starting to contemplate going back to school and then returning to school, they've seen an upturn where he is based in attempted suicides. And you think, look, there's a spectrum here, but clearly it is for a lot of people. And it's hard to say percentage wise, but I would say, for the majority of people, this has been very challenging. And this has almost like been a destabilizing experience for a number of people. But what I find is, Andy, almost like the Blitz spirit that we talked about in the early part of the war, in the Second World War, I think we experienced that back in March last year, back in 2020. I think people were fairly galvanized. I think there was this sense of we're all in this together. And I think there was also a sense in which it'll probably be over by the end of the summer. And I think a lot of people have talked about in the UK, and I know Andrew's dialing in from Singapore, but certainly in the UK, this third lockdown that started on January the 5th, and we're still gradually coming out of, loads of people have said, this was the real kicker. This was the real tough one. So I'd love to be able to give you a concrete and decisive answer. I think this concept of, it depends and it's subjective would come into play. But I certainly think it's been obviously it'd be an understatement to say it's been a challenging experience. But that's not to say that some people actually haven't found it okay, because some people have.
I think it's a really interesting point, and I certainly know for myself, from the outside, people think that I'm a very extrovert social person, and I have that element of my personality. But because of the amount of time that I typically, pre-pandemic would have spent at events and social occasions, both for business and for pleasure, the first 2 or 3 months of the pandemic were sort of a rest for me, a bit of a relief. This third lockdown has been, as you say, it's been the kicker for me. There's quite a lot I want to unwrap from your answer, but I think that one of the key things, and I touched on it in my first question, is the role of technology, and you mentioned specifically social media, because I think it has been, as you say, called it both a blessing and a curse over the course of the pandemic. For those who were isolated, it at least gave some connection, and it gave the ability to engage with people and have some social interaction. But it's not the same as physical interaction. I'm going to ask you in a second just how generally has technology and social media specifically affected our ability to be happy. But before I do, Andrew Bryant was happy with your answer. He says, great catch, Paul. And we've been joined by Jeff Ram, the OMG and customer service expert, and a good friend of both of us. And
can I interrupt, Andy? He was a good friend for both of us
before this week.
And that was before Charlton played Sunderland and before Wigan played Sunderland in these last few days.
Yeah.
I reckon Mr. Ram is purely on this podcast because he wants to wreck it. That'll make him happy.
I was going to be diplomatic and not mention that, so thanks for jumping in with that, Paul. So,
I had to.
Yeah, I had to. So, good morning, Jeff, and thanks for the 6 points between us. Paul, how does technology affect our ability to be happy? How does social media impact us?
Okay, well, and it is interesting, isn't it? If you literally go back, 14 years ago, and you're in a cafe on June the 28th, and you go into this cafe, and there's certain things you would notice. First of all, when you want to order a coffee, there's possibly two choices, black and white, right? And there's one milk option, and that's dairy. And you're looking around the cafe, and you're seeing people. Maybe some of them are on their own, but they're reading a book or they're reading a newspaper. You'll see people actually talking to each other. And there might be someone who's actually got a phone in their hand, but they're not looking at it and scrolling through it. They're actually holding it to their ear and they're talking to somebody. And that is a picture from 14 years ago. And June the 28th was the day before Apple released the iPhone. And if you wanted to access Facebook, and you could do on a computer or a laptop, but you couldn't have, we didn't even know what apps were. And you suddenly think, wow, in 14 years, just think about all that's happened. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because, we are more greatly connected now. And we evolved as a species. They reckon that the biggest largest group we ever grew to as a tribe was around 150 people. And now, because of technology, well, we can tap into, the support. You could call it the support on one level of what, I don't know, is it 7.8 billion or so people? And so in some ways, technology, how's it impacted our happiness? Well, again, if you think about this, what if the pandemic had happened in 2007 and not 2020? We would have been restricted on how we could have connected with each other. Our road all of a sudden, and we kind of the houses on our road are fairly set back from the road. We hardly know the neighbours, and all of a sudden there's a WhatsApp group. And so for some people, they actually were able to, because of social media, access blogs, access help around mental health, get links to YouTube and watch useful videos. And you've got all that side of things that actually could connect people, and people who didn't feel isolated. A couple of my friends are blind, and they have found, or visually impaired, whichever language you want to use, but basically they can't see. So they have found technology an absolute, it liberates them. But then you've also got, I think, if I was to take, well, we can look at a number of platforms, but let's just look at, say, Twitter and Instagram. And I'm on Twitter, by the way, at the Sumo Guy. And I'm on Instagram at the Sumo Guy. And for me, just like for you, Andy, it's my way of reaching my audience and engaging with my audience. But what I find is that, the keyboard warriors, all of a sudden, I've got this phrase, manage your mental diet. And what I realize can happen and has happened is that as people are scrolling sometimes mindlessly on Twitter, I might see a particular comment about, Prince Philip, but then I start to, a tweet, but then I read the comments, and it's the comments that can get you. And I've had to suddenly realize, Paul, is what I'm reading making me angry or anxious? Because if it is, I need to stop doing that. So is it social media to blame, or is it the fact that it's a tool, but we're maybe not using the tool so well and we're getting hooked in? I think about Instagram. And, in How to Have a Great Life, it's not a unique phrase to me, but we need to be careful of comparing our unedited lives with the edited lives of others. And I think it was was it Beyonce or something who talked about you can, to take the perfect selfie, take 300 photos. Well, who's got the time to do that? But I go back to this, well, a tribe of 150 people. When we had that tribe, when I was a kid at school in the 1970s, my tribe was my schoolmates. That was it. And I wasn't, and I might compare myself to, Christopher Armitage, who was a great actor and was great at English and history and maths and flipping everything else. But there was only maybe me comparing myself with Christopher Armitage. Now, because of things like Instagram, I can potentially compare myself with billions of other people on the planet. And it can make me feel inadequate. And we're in a society, aren't we? I'm not a particularly political person. I enjoy maybe looking at the communication styles of politicians, and I voted probably for every party, well, not for every party going, but for a number of different parties over the time. But the reality is, the world, capitalism makes, works by making us feel inadequate at times, like we're just not quite good enough. But if you drive this car, wear this suit, buy these trainers, then you will feel happy and you will be good enough. Or if you have this experience, that will make you happy, and then you're good. And then you have it, and then you buy the trainers, and then you realize next year there's a new pair coming out and they're even better than the ones you've got. And we live in a, for capitalism to work, in a sense, for consumerism to work, we need more, and therefore how can those organizations who are trying to sell their product get us to buy more? Well, in some respects, maybe I'm oversimplifying it, by making us feel a little less and making us feel that there is a hole, and that hole is where happiness lives. But if you buy our product, or if you use our service, that will fill the hole. And then you get it, and then there's another hole appears and another hole appears. So for some people, we've grown up and finally, hopefully, got to a place of some self-worth and self-acceptance. And it's still nice to buy stuff and feel good, but there's not this sense in which then I'll have arrived and then I'll be happy. But there's this sense of, no, I do want to buy those trainers and I do want to buy that suit or whatever. But I think for some people, there is this sense of you're never quite enough. You're never quite enough, are you? And that's why you need this, and that's why you need that. And even in the self-help industry, I in my Sumo book that came out in 2005, and I'd written a few other books before that, but that became the iconic book. That became the game changer. But one of the first things I put in that is a quote from Eric Berne, a psychologist from the 1960s, who said, "You don't have to be ill to get better." And why I wanted to lead with that quote is, yeah, we can develop ourselves, and that's good and that's healthy, and some form of mild dissatisfaction is good because it drives us to want to achieve more and accomplish more and be more. Great. But I want to start from the premise, not that you're broken and you read one of my books and that'll sort you out and fix you, but that we're all on a journey, aren't we? And we all need each other. But you don't have to be ill to get better. And also there's the myth, I believe, that in some aspects of the self-help industry and in motivation, that there's one answer, there's one magic bullet, there's, and there's this particular one. And if you do this, and if you read this book, then it's all sorted. And we are selling people a massive lie. We really are. And sadly, I'm part of that industry. And that's why one of the things that I try and do is share my stuff, share some successes, but share my struggles as well. And I know Jeff's on this call. I remember when he was president of the organization, we're part of Professional Speakers Association, and he was the closing speaker. And people still talk about his speech because he didn't say, "Let me tell you about my amazing year." He talked about how hard he'd found things. And so I hope, and that's why I think with your book, Just Ask, Andy, there's hopefully there's a few of us championing a little bit more honesty and authenticity, and not saying that you just need this book or this program and all your life will be sorted. But we're all on this journey together. We're making a few things up as we go along. We're stumbling, we're struggling, and we're succeeding. And that's just part of how it is.
There's a couple of things I want to pick on from what you said. Jeff has come back and he said, did you know mentioning Charlton and Wigan in one sentence can make people very unhappy? We apologise for that, Jeff, but just look at the league table and you'll cheer up again. The first thing is, you talked about the selfies and the quote you attributed to Beyonce about, to find the perfect selfie, you need to take 300. In Just Ask, you may remember, I looked at the different approaches to vulnerability between generations. And in particular, how does the generation coming through now, the millennials and the Gen Zs, how does their approach to vulnerability differ to the boomers and the Gen Xers? Our generations. I think we're both Gen X. And I interviewed my niece, who was 21 at the time, and had been still studying at university, but had just finished a project on whether her generation was the loneliest generation ever. And Sam was the first person to introduce me to the phrase social perfectionism, and how her generation, and Sam's just in Gen Z, her generation is driven by comparison, which goes very much to the point you were making. Seeing everyone live their lives on Instagram, on now it would be TikTok, on Snapchat and so forth, and comparing themselves for every selfie. And this is an image that I use a lot now in my talks. For every selfie you see published, are there 299 that have been discarded? And is that the image of our lives that we're projecting? Is that real happiness? I mean, how can we break that cycle and get more authentic?
It's a tragic thing, isn't it? And I don't think anybody can be blamed. I think that social media has been set up in such a way, hasn't it, that it can become addictive, and we get a dopamine hit every time we get a like or whatever. But what part I think comes back to education as well, and helping, this whole thing about well-being and human flourishing. Those might be the language you use, but perhaps we need to teach kids not just about the Battle of Hastings was in 1066, but what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be kind and compassionate? How does our brain work? Why can't kids in primary schools getting older learn about oxytocin and dopamine and serotonin, and how they can actually find those hits, that cocktail of happiness within their own brain from doing some stuff that's really healthy, whereas actually we can get the dopamine hit from doing stuff that's unhealthy. And I do find it's very sad. When there was a little bit more freedom and flexibility in the UK last year, London, and we went into this restaurant, and then a group of young women, probably aged from about, I don't know, maybe 20 to 25, walked in. And they literally and it was a nice restaurant, but I realized they'd walked in and they weren't going to eat. They were just going to have some drinks, but they just spent all their time posing and taking photos, and then retaking them and retaking them and retaking them. And the thing is, it was a group of mates in a beautiful environment. I just wanted to go up to them and just say, why don't you just enjoy this? Why don't you just enjoy the moment? And the experience of being here, enjoy your drinks, enjoy each other's company, maybe take a couple of photos, but it almost became like a glorified photo shoot. And it is sad, but then, it's a bit like Pavlov's dog, isn't it? If we get conditioned that by society that this will make you happy, then that's what we pursue, isn't it? And I think it's up to all of us to have a bit of compassion and understanding with where people are at, understand the pressures that young people are on as well. And I think a lot of it does come down to education, but rather than trying to be against something and going, the woes of Instagram, I mean, it can be wonderful as well for people, can't it? But just think about, okay, well, rather than be against something, what can we be for? And we can be for kindness, and we can be for the whole concept of gratitude and why that's important. And actually, struggles can strengthen you. So when you land on the snake in the game of Let Snakes and Ladders, it's okay. It's not the end of the world. You help young people to realize that, feelings are temporary. Their emotions do pass. They're not permanent. And unfortunately, when young people and older people get into a place of low mood, then they can see no hope and they feel that those feelings won't fade. And sometimes they make some very, very drastic choices that can be literally devastating for them and the people in their lives. So I think there needs to be a lot more around education. And I don't want to stand here and sit here and demonize social media and technology. I think we need to embrace it, make the most of it, see it as a tool. But I think we need to equip all of us, and that means me as well as a 56-year-old bloke, with the best way to use it and to promote it. And just to think about people's, I don't like to think just about mental health. I think this is about holistic health. Happiness isn't just about how I'm feeling that day and what I'm thinking. It could be related to what I ate that morning, whether I took any exercise. I think we need to take a far more holistic approach. People have been getting, their six-pack, from going to the gym, or when they could go to the gym. But what about your mental six-pack? What about all this kind of, you talk about connection. Well, I think there is a mind-body connection. I think there's a mind-body and emotion connection. And we need to look at people more holistically rather than just in compartments. I think that was a long answer for a Wigan Athletic fan, wasn't it? Flipping Jeff's nodded off. Jeff, wake up, mate.
It's all right. Jeff's chatting to my mum on the chat at the moment because she's enjoying this as well.
That's lovely. He's that engaged in me flipping insights. Thanks, Ram. Ram.
For anyone listening to the podcast and think they're going off a bit with their mates at the moment, don't forget this is a podcast about the power of professional relationships. And look how when you really get to know each other on a human level, you can have that more relaxed, enjoyable conversation. So I make no apologies, and I hope that you're enjoying the fact that we can have that engagement in our network. But from that long answer, Paul, I want to pick up on one thing in particular, and you said you don't want to disparage technology and social media completely, and I think that one of the key things is balance and getting a balance right. You talked about the group of friends taking photos, and I know that there are people who hate it when they see people take pictures of their food in a restaurant. There's people, I used to go to gigs a lot with someone who hated people taking pictures at gigs. Now, going to concerts is one of my biggest joys in life. And I've been going to, I can't tell you how many concerts I've been to over the years. It will be in the hundreds. But I have very limited memories of the ones that I went to from my teen years. My first concert, I was 13, 14, the Eurythmics. But from that first concert through to mobile phones and social media, I have little blips of memories. There's bands I've forgotten I've seen. I forgot I saw my favourite artist, Lou Reed, support U2 until I was looking at the bill years later and I saw that Lou Reed had been on the bill. Now I've got videos, I've got photos. I don't stand at the concert and take videos for the whole time, but I take snippet here and a snippet there, and then 2 or 3 years later it's a memory.
Absolutely.
You and I enjoy going out for walks. And we post photos of our walks. I've now got a splashback in my kitchen behind my cooker that I love of a sunset I took on my walk, and I'm redecorating, and my artwork is all going to be from my walks, from my photos.
Awesome.
But if I only spend the time taking photos, I don't see nature. So I have to get the balance, and I think that's got to be a key thing.
Absolutely. And I think it's great. You think again about social media, Facebook. I love Facebook memories. And they come up and they remind me of things. So it's great to capture some of this, which is why when I thought about those young women who were in that restaurant, that I was just like, take a couple of photos would be great. But you spend probably, virtually all their time. When they finished the drinks, they went. And I'm like, you were there, not really for yourself, but to try and maybe impress people who weren't there. And I just think it is a little bit sad. But hey, we're all deep down, we're all quite superficial at times. So, I'm as much part of this as the problem as other people as well. So that's why I think we need to be more role models. You talked about comparison earlier on. But, you know, we do, that's how we learn as a young child. We start to learn not by just what we're told, but how we see others around us behave. And therefore, our generation, whichever generation wants to label it, and I was like, I think actually I'm flipping a baby boomer, believe it or not. But it's like, well, what am I modeling? What are the messages? My two kids are in their 20s. Well, how do I role model to them? Because you cannot not be a role model. People are observing you, whether you're aware of it or not, particularly your family members.
Definitely. And again, it's that balance that's the key. It's just finding, you know, you don't, by being a role model, you don't have to have perfectionism in your own life. As a leader, you need to be authentic and be yourself, but get the balance
Totally.
right. Yeah.
Totally. And I think sometimes for a leader, and there needs to be vulnerability. Brené Brown talks about vulnerability, but she also talks about having boundaries, which I think is an important thing. But there is where you might let your guard down a little bit and people see that you're human. And that can promote within your own teams that greater sense of honesty. I mean, can you imagine a leader giving a talk where they say, let me tell you about the biggest mistake I've ever made in my life and what I learned from it? Wow, flipping heck. That's interesting, isn't it? And when you do listen to lots of leaders talk about things now, and I love consuming podcasts, I just think it's really healthy when they go, yeah, and then I had this success, then I had that success, and then I had that. You know, I mean, I listened to Chris Evans interview Gary Barlow. All right, not your typical maybe people to mention on a more of a business type podcast, but we're about humans and about connection. And you could say actually, Chris Evans and Gary Barlow are incredibly successful business people and entrepreneurs, but they both talk about their challenges. They both talk about their struggles, and I think they now appreciate life a lot more. And, you know, does perfectionism really exist? The word perfect means it cannot be improved upon, you know, and I just think we just need to press pause and go, okay, we want to aim for excellence, we want to do our best, but maybe perfectionism isn't really, you know, shouldn't really be the goal, but it should be about experiencing life, enjoying life, helping to support other people on their journey as well, rather than being so thinking, you know, wrapped up in trying to create a perfect image of who we are, because deep down we all flipping well know it doesn't exist.
Okay, so on that point of aiming for perfectionism, and you talked earlier, or you touched earlier on consumerism, you know, wanting, and the way the way I think you described it as capitalism works on making us feel that we can improve. There's better we can get. So do we?
Which can be healthy. Again, goes back to your word balance.
Yeah.
Absolutely, it's good to try and improve.
Which Jeff has commented on as well, about saying balance is crucial in different spaces. Is there a tendency, and I think it's been talked about a lot over the years, but a tendency to postpone happiness until we've got that dream job, we've got the car we want, the home we want, the relationship we want, the new washer dryer we want, whatever it might be. How do we, let's assume there is that tendency. Let me reframe the question. How do we break that tendency to postpone happiness?
I think there is first of all that honest conversation we need to have with ourselves, because I was definitely I'll be happy when ... And my wife noticed that, you know, when Sumo came out and W.H. Smith made it Business Book of the Month, you know, I'll be happy when I see my books in airports and railway stations. And then it was like, it's no longer number one. It's no longer number one. It's now, and it's like, I'll be happy when. Then I said to my wife, I said, well, can't you just be happy? The book's out then, it's doing well. Yeah, but I'll be happy when it hits 10,000. It hits 10,000 sales. Well, yeah, well, I'll be happy when it gets to 50,000. That would be a real significant number. Hits 50,000. Well, do you know what? I'll be happy when it hits 100,000. And it was just like, I was on this treadmill of constantly, I was searching for happiness, because in my mind, it was a destiny. It was a place to reach, to arrive at. And I think it's that, and I'm still goal orientated to an extent, and goals can be healthy and can give us that purpose and sense of direction and sense of achievement. Of course they can. But what I realized was I decided my happiness is completely attached to an arbitrary goal that I make. I mean, I'd even have things about my weight. I'll be happy when I'm a certain weight. So in other words, what we're really saying is I will postpone my life satisfaction and my enjoyment of life until I've reached a certain target or goal.
Yeah.
And then guess what? When you reach that target and goal, then it's like, what next? And you'll find that a number of Olympians, and Johnny Wilkinson talks quite candidly about this, how the happiest he was in life was not when England won the Rugby World Cup in 2003. Sorry for our Australian listeners, but was actually 5 minutes before the end of that game, because he was still involved and experiencing it. And then as soon as they'd achieved their goal, and as soon as someone's won a gold medal, it's like, what next? My whole purpose in life has been to achieve this one thing. And we've been subtly told, and sometimes not subtly told, once you reach that goal, then you'll be happy. So it is that having that sense of honesty, and it's that sense of, actually, I can be happy now. That doesn't mean, and when we use this word happy, doesn't mean totally satisfied, don't need to improve myself, don't want to make progress. But Andy Lapata, Paul McGee, Jeff Ram, Andrew Bryan, and everyone else who's listening, you can be happy now and still want to do things. You see, in How to Have a Great Life, and Jeff's point about balance, one of the things that I say is, what we're told is, you'll be good if you do something. You'll be happy if this happens. And I'm now coming to the point of, I'm happy and I want that experience and I want that product. But my happiness is not dependent on something that's going to happen in my life. It's almost like something which I'm thinking, maybe we're born to be happy. When you see a young child, once they've had the nappy changed and they're being fed, they're usually pretty happy. So maybe it's a state of getting back to who we are deep down. We were born to be happy, rather than feel we've got to achieve to be happy.
I'm thinking back to one of the very first podcasts in the Connected Leadership podcast, when I interviewed Goldie Sayers, the former Team GB captain and British record holder in the javelin. And Goldie finally got her Olympic medal about 10 years after the event, because the Russian athlete had tested positive for drugs.
Oh yes.
And by that stage, that wasn't her goal. That wasn't what happiness was, and the medal is hanging over a bin in her home.
Yeah.
And you assume that and I've known Goldie for a number of years before that, I was almost happy. I felt like I was happier than her, in a sense, when she got it, because I knew how important it was to her. But she'd moved on from that. Basically,
what you're saying, Andy, is that Goldie had been happy with a silver, and then when she got a gold, Goldie was no longer happy.
Well, actually, she got a bronze. She finished fourth. Right. She finished fourth, but it was the Olympic medal. She got bronze. She got the Olympic medal, which was the key.
And it's interesting, because when you say you were happier for her than she was, my wife Helen's happier for me than I am sometimes. And it is learning just to appreciate, what we have got and what we sometimes have achieved.
And I'm guilty of this. Yesterday, someone congratulated me on Just Ask and Connected Leadership, both being category finalists in the Business Book Awards. And I said, well, the final's in May. That's what I'm gunning for. And it's just like, enjoy the moment. Enjoy being in the top 6 in the categories. And then if anything else comes, that'll be great, but it's still an achievement. And she actually said, didn't quite put it like that, but she said, but it's still an achievement. And I didn't let myself celebrate it in the way I could. So let's turn things around a little bit. We talked a lot about happiness. We touched earlier on mental health. I want to know your thoughts on where the line is between being unhappy and mental health problems. And how do we prevent ourselves and other people from tipping over the line, from just being in a state of unhappiness to actually having real issues? And your picture is frozen, so I've got a feeling I have lost you. Jeff, Claire, anyone else, if you can comment and say if you can hear me, then I know whether it's my connection or Paul's that's gone down. Assuming that I'm still live, while we're waiting for Paul to come back online, or me too, Jeff said, I think happiness are pockets of time, with a person, with a thing, achieving a bucket list moment, etc. As soon as it's finished, it's like, what's next? I don't think it's a bad thing to look for more. Just appreciate and look in the rearview mirrors from time to time to relive that moment of happiness. It's why I buy a gift from the country I've been to and display in my office. It's a constant reminder, rearview, and I do that as well, Jeff. Paul, I think we've got you back. You're coming and going. Yeah, everyone can hear me. Thank you, Guy. Thanks, Colleen. It's great to hear you. Paul seems to have a problem with his internet connection. Hang with us because we've got more to cover. We're coming towards the end of this podcast, but there's going to be a follow-up with the Thursday. So just while we're waiting for Paul, to let you know what will happen, I'm going to finish with the question that I'd asked Paul, maybe one more. We'll sign off that interview and then we'll go straight into our Thursday episode. It's a bit shorter, about 15 minutes, where I asked Paul about the power of his professional relationships, assuming, of course, that he comes back and gets some internet connection and can rejoin us. What I'm going to do is put my phone back online and see if I can reach him and find out what's happening. In the meantime, please do type you know your own thoughts on this and what you've heard so far. Do you consider yourself happy? And if not, what's getting in the way? If you do, what's making you so?
Hi, mate.
I can hear you in my headphones, but your image is frozen.
Yeah, I just completely, I just lost you. You were talking and it just went.
You're back. I'll hang up. We have Paul back. There we go. The miracles of modern technology. Pick up the phone and he'll come back online as well. So I don't know if you could hear much of that, Paul. Jeff gave us his own perspective on being happy, which helped just give a different perspective while you were offline. But let me go back to that question that I was asking you at the time. So,
hey Andy, I don't know if you can hear me or not, but I can't hear anything at all.
You can't hear me at all. Okay. Again, everyone else, can you hear me okay? I'm going to text you, Paul. I'm going to ask Paul to sign out and then dial back in again. So again, please do bear with us. None of these events seem to go without any issue. So dial off and then back in again. I've just texted that to Paul. Thank you, Guy. The problem now is that Paul can't hear me. So I'm just asking him to dial off and then back in again, and then hopefully we can get him back. So we'll see him disappear, and then hopefully the line will ring any second and we'll have him back. So I hope you're finding this useful. This is there we go. The third in four where we've had tech issues. Paul, can you hear me okay?
I am back.
You're
I think,
back.
see, I knew. By the way, this Jeff Ram guy that we keep on talking about, we are good mates. And actually, from a professional point of view, both we've managed to refer clients to each other. But I do think that Charlton Wigan comment we made earlier is trying to sabotage this. But yeah, so I'm back. Have you been filling the airtime in my absence?
I have.
The audience a break from my northern tones.
I've been doing my best. I have found that we've got a few people have been a bit quiet on the call, like Guy Massey and Colleen Knight. So I've got them out of the woodwork by saying, "Can you hear me?" or have I gone offline? But so that's great. So let's pick up, because I'm aware that everyone's time and there's quite a lot to cover still with the two, finishing this podcast and then going on to the other one. So the question I was asking you, I'll go back to that. We've talked a lot about happiness, but I want to reflect for a moment. We touched on it earlier. I want to reflect on unhappiness, and particularly where the line is between being unhappy and having mental health problems. How do we know where people are at, whether it's ourselves or whether it's other people? And I guess equally importantly, how do we ensure that someone who's unhappy that the issue doesn't get worse and tip over into mental health issues?
Okay, I don't know whether it's easy to make such a distinction, Andy, if I'm perfectly honest. And again, it's a bit like that wrestling with that fish. It's not always easy to define, is it? Because for some people, maybe they talk about mental health issues can occur for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's your personal circumstances. You've gone through a divorce, you've got financial problems, and that, you've lost your job. Well, that doesn't just make you unhappy, but it's not going to actually enhance your mental health. Now, when do we say, well, when does unhappiness turn to mental health problems? Well, I don't know if it's an easy thing to actually define. And if I was to say how hard it is to define, and also how hard it is to spot the signs, I'd take you back to an event that happened 10 years ago, back in, I think it was 2011, when Gary Speed, took his own life. Well, Gary Speed took his own life, I think, on a late Saturday night, early Sunday morning. But, the context was he'd been on Football Focus with Dan Walker during the day. He'd lined up to play golf with Alan Shearer on the Monday. But in the early hours of Sunday morning, I think it was, he took his own life. And I think we can look and go, hang on a minute, why didn't we spot the signs? And I think we oversimplify life generally. There's complexity to all of this. There's nuances. There's still trying to grow in understanding. And we sometimes assume that if you are struggling, then we assume two things. One, if you're struggling, everyone will realize that. And two, if you're struggling, you'll ask for help.
Yeah.
Well, there are people who've gone through dark experiences. I've gone through my own personal dark experiences. My own cousin took his own life. And I think we just need to, it's about just checking in on how people are. But it's not about thinking it'll be obvious what the signs are, because they're not. And actually, as someone who's gone through my own dark times, strangely enough, you don't always feel like I'm going to reach out and ask for help here, because you can be in that dark place. But what I've learned is to be saying to myself, this is how you're feeling now, and that's valid. That's okay. I mean, I talk about this concept in Sumo of hippo time. It's okay to not always feel okay. To feel mad, bad, or sad is okay. And I think what, again, we've tried to tell people is, if you're not feeling happy all the time, something's wrong with you. And therefore, when we don't, we think there's something wrong with me and I've got mental health issues. No. Loads of people can jump into labeling things, I've got mental health problems, when actually, what no offense, but in some cases, you're going through a tough time. You're in a low mood. And maybe it's because simple practical things like you're not taking any exercise, you're not moving, you're eating a really unhealthy diet. Food affects mood. So I go back to this whole thing about education, to quote a certain prime minister, and just understanding that, no, if you were to say, here is a pill, and if you take this pill, you'll be happy all the time, would you take it? Most people go, yeah, I would. And then you kind of go, hang on a minute, but what about when you're at a funeral? How do you want to feel then? How do you want to feel when you lose your dream job? How do you want to feel when you're a Sunderland supporter, and you play Charlton or Wigan? How do you want to feel when, maybe you're competing in something and you don't win, or you underperform? But don't worry, but I'm happy all the time. Can we see how actually it would be bizarre and actually quite ridiculous to want to be happy all the time? It's an emotion. It's a good emotion. It's a bit subjective. But we also need to acknowledge to feel mad, bad, or sad is valid. We shouldn't demonize negative emotions. We should learn to understand them, try and understand, well, what are they trying to teach me, if indeed they are trying to teach me anything, and not be owned by our emotions, but at least acknowledge and accept them. And if anyone wanted to explore this a bit further, I would definitely recommend a book by Susan David called Emotional Agility, and definitely follow her on Twitter as well, Susan David. She's got some wonderful insights around this. So sorry not to be able to give you that really simplified, concise answer, Andy, but it's a pretty complex topic.
It's really important advice and insight. Colin Knight has said that's so true. There is such a thing as toxic positivity.
100%, yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier the self-development industry, which you're in, I'm in to a degree, and I've also been a consumer of. And one of the things I talk about in Just Ask early on is, I remember back in probably the 90s, when all the American self-help gurus were saying, when people ask you how you are, why are you saying I'm fine? Why don't you say I'm great, I'm awesome, I'm fantastic? To me, that's toxic positivity. I've not used that phrase before, but if you're
Yeah.
not fantastic, then the whole point of Just Ask is that you tell the truth. And
Absolutely.
it's
And I
out
think,
there.
again, that's why when we joked at the very beginning, I say, look, I'm from Manchester. You're not going to get California motivation, because the
Yeah.
fact is, people do label me motivational speaker. So they have all these expectations. And then when I talk about hippo time, what a hippo's doing, what they wallow, and it's okay. And you've got to process your pain, digest your disappointment, sit with your sadness. For some people, it's like, well, that's a bit radical. I remember doing an event in South Africa, and this woman said, she said, I just consume self-help. And yet I've never ever come across this concept of hippo time. And that is the most profound thing I've ever heard, that actually it is okay at times to not always feel okay. That needs to be part of our holistic message, I think, within the personal development world. I'm massively into it. I'm an advocate for it, but I'll be prepared to challenge it when I see stuff that I think is not helpful. And forced positivity or toxic positivity is really destructive.
I'd agree. And I just want to go back to one of the other points that you made. You talked about Gary Speed. For those listening or watching who don't know, Gary Speed was
Yeah.
the Wales manager who sadly took his own life in about 2011, as Paul said.
Yeah.
In Just Ask, I dedicate the book to Richard, and I share Richard's story at the beginning. And Richard took his own life, and it came out of the blue. And it was to such a point that when Richard passed away and we didn't know what had happened at this stage, I turned to a friend of mine who worked closely with him, and I said, have you got any idea what happened? And he had seen him 2 weeks before. They'd worked on a project together, and there'd been absolutely no indication that anything was wrong at all. So very much backing that up. I include hippo time in Just Ask because I think
Yeah,
it's a
you
phenomenal
do.
concept. Laura Ash has just commented and said hippo time has been really revolutionary for me. And I think absolutely. And hello, Laura. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Awesome work.
Yeah,
Check out Laura
yeah.
Ash and her hubby
Rock,
Barry doing
yeah,
more awesome work.
rock solid, rock solid. And you talked earlier about looking at health holistically. That's what rock solid do. So well worth.
100%. That's why I'm such a champion of their
Yeah,
work as
yeah,
well. I
yeah.
really am. It's brilliant.
Yeah, fantastic. Right, I've got one last question. We can't finish talking about unhappiness. So I want to bring it back to happiness, and I want to bring it back to the underlying theme of the podcast series, which is the importance of professional relationships. So do happier people find it easier to forge strong professional relationships?
Okay, and the best way to answer that is actually say, well, would unhappier people, and there's a term that's banded around by a number of speakers called mood hoovers, the people who see a bit of joy and positivity around the place and go, we need to suck that right out of here and spread a bit of misery in its place. Would you want to work with a mood hoover? Clearly you wouldn't. We banned smoking in enclosed public spaces in Northern Ireland, England and Wales in 2007 because of the effects of passive smoking. Well, I think we need to be aware of the effects of passive moaning, and therefore are happier people easier to work with? Well, what's the alternative? Working with the mood hoovers and the people who you're struggling because of their moaning. So in a nutshell, yes, they are.
So go out and be happy. That's the
Well,
underlying
maybe it's
message.
not quite as I'd love to say it's be happy, because that's just almost like counterproductive to all we've talked about. I'm saying be real, recognize, you know what, maybe don't go be happy. You know what, you go, be kind, be grateful, and happiness will look after itself.
On that note, Paul, thank you so much. You're going to come back and talk about your own professional relationships and the role they've had in your career. You've recommended one book. You're going to hopefully recommend some more resources as well. But for the moment, thank you very much.
Been a pleasure. Thanks, Andy.
Great. Stay on the line, everyone. We're going to just crack on. But thank you so much, everyone, for your engagement. I love it when I see the comments come flying in. I'm sure Paul enjoys it as well. I normally pop them up on screen, but for some reason, my software has changed it from a really readable font to something like this that you can see now, where it's black on a black background, which isn't very readable. So I will be looking at that for our next broadcast. But we're going to go straight on to our shorter Thursday broadcast. My mum has just commented on Facebook, "You've made me happy." I think she's talking to you, Paul.
I love your mum. I don't know who she is, but I love her. Thank you, Mrs. Lapata.
Right, so let's crack on with our Thursday one. Laura's just caught the end of this. It was good to hear this morning. Thank you, Laura. Don't go away. We've got more. So, Paul, we're going to start off and we're going to talk about the role of professional relationships in your career, both good and not so good. So let's start off with the positive. Where have professional relationships had a really strong impact on your career?
I'd mention a woman called Jacqueline Guthrie. I'd lost my job many years ago through ill health, became ill with ME, and ultimately was not in a position to ever work, it would seem, full time ever again or get a job. And in the end, that's why I became self-employed, because I could be my own boss and pass my own medical. And it was not an easy start to my career and trying to generate income and work. But I saw an advert it would have been 1994 for an organization called Career Track, based in America, but they had a base in the UK as well. And they were doing one-day seminars. And to cut a long story short, they were after people based in the UK to present their seminars. I sent this video in, and Jacqueline Guthrie saw the video and just went, okay, well, let's have a meeting. She met me, and then she said, I'm going to give you a one-day seminar. I'm going to do it in Bolton. We don't usually get a lot of people attend the seminar in Bolton. No offense to Bolton. But I don't want to give you like a big event in London. I want to give you this one in Bolton and just see how it goes. And she was at and it would have just been an absolute game changer for me if they would took me on as an associate to deliver their seminars. And she sat at the back of the room while I did this one-day event. The last started at 9 till 4. And what she said, and I've got this phrase, Andy: words change worlds. Words change worlds. And she said to me at the end, she said, like, I've got loads of feedback I need to give you. But she said, I just want you to know this, Paul. Today wasn't an amazing day, but I saw enough in you to believe that you could be one of our top presenters in the world. Wow. She took me on. I was the second youngest speaker that ever used around the world. It opened up opportunities, not just to speak throughout the UK, but I got to speak in Hong Kong a couple of times, in Malaysia and in Singapore. And that one relationship with Jacqueline, who took a risk with me in some respects, it was a big risk to her. And I was, I didn't have a hugely, successful business background at all. And yet she just saw something in me. And I would, I mention her in one of my books. And I would just always say, one of the reasons why I'm at where I'm at today, I've had a lot of people support me along the way. But Jacqueline Guthrie was the game changer.
It's really interesting that I think more over the last few weeks than anything else, there's been a theme in responses to this question of people who showed faith, people who believed in you and gave you that chance. And when we look at the relationships that really make an impact on our lives, people who show that faith in us, show that belief in us, give us that confidence to spring forward and achieve things that otherwise we might not have had the courage to go for. And it sounds very much, again, that you've gone through the same experience.
Absolutely. And she gave me not just the encouragement, but she also gave me the really helpful feedback from that event to know what I'd done well and how to build on it, but where I definitely needed to address a number of weaknesses, development areas, most definitely. So she didn't just encourage me, but she equipped me.
So let me ask you this. In the self-development world, which we talked about in the Monday podcast, and in our professional speaking world, you'll be aware of the phrase, the praise sandwich. And that is whenever you give feedback, put the bread is the praise, the filling is the constructive criticism, as we're encouraged to term it, or feed forward, as our friend Nigel Risner would have it. What's your view on that? Is it important to couch anything constructive rather than negative? Because I think it is important that it helps people move forward. Do you think it's always important to have something positive alongside that? Or if it's couched the right way, the right feedback can be valuable on its own?
I think it depends on the person you're talking to, doesn't it? If you're talking to someone who's fairly new in the role, they're lacking a little bit of confidence, then actually you need to point something out. But that could literally, destabilize them and floor them if you just come in very bluntly and go, "You did this wrong. You need to sort it out." But there could be another personality, couldn't there, who again is new to the job, new to the role, but they'll go, "Fine, at least I know where I stand and I'll get on with it." So I think it's again about this not one size fits all approach. It's about knowing your people. But also there comes a point where, as someone who's very experienced, let's say, for instance, you want to give me feedback on how the podcasts have gone. Well, I'm a 56-year-old bloke. I've been running my own business for 30 years, da 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 da. And if you was to give me the praise sandwich, well, can I just say, first of all, Paul, I love the way you did da 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 da. I was a bit concerned about X, Y, and Z. But like I say, I think you did really, it's like I can spot the flipping praise sandwich, Andy.
Yeah.
I think we know each other. And also the thing that's important about feedback is I know your intention. And I know your intention is, I'm just saying this, Paul, because it's my perspective, and I think this could help you. You're not trying to have a go at me. You're not trying to have ego wars with me. You're becoming from it. So in our relationship, it might well be, and I've done that with some of your books, haven't I? I said, look, there is some stuff I like here, but mate, I've just got to challenge you about this. I think you can do this better. But we've got that relationship, and you've always known I'm for you. You know how much I'm a champion, particularly of just ask. But so I think you could take that. And if it's like a praise sandwich, that can become a bit patronizing. But for some other person, it could be super helpful, and and last impressions last. And Alex Ferguson wouldn't give a praise sandwich, but one of the things that apparently he was often good at saying to people, having given them a rebuke, he'd finish by saying, "You're better than that." In other words, I've got an expectation of you, and what you did today, you're better than that. So he challenged what he saw in front of him, but in some ways left people by going, "Yeah, I am better than that, aren't I? That was unacceptable. I went below the standards." And so can you imagine Alex Ferguson or anyone else giving a praise sandwich? Well, I like the way, you walked onto the pitch. I like the way you did some of your passing. Little bit of a problem, the fact that you got sent off having given away a ridiculous penalty that cost us the game. But like I say, loved your work in training earlier this week. Rubbish, ridiculous. So again, it's I talk to people about tools, not giving you a prescription. And tools, let's not demonize certain things. Praise sandwiches is always awful. No, in certain situations it could work, but not in every situation. Here's a profound comment. You don't cut the hedge with a lawnmower. So it's a good tool, but you've got to use it in the right situation on the right job.
Love it. I'm so glad you said that. So let's move on. The relationships where things haven't gone so well, what's happened and what have you learned from them?
I think back in about 2008, was developing Sumo for schools, and I took on various people to help me build that. And I guess one of the things that I've learned is just because you like someone and you get on very well with them and they're big fans of your work and they love your work, doesn't automatically mean they're therefore going to perform well. And there is a difference between confidence and competence, and you want both. And I've realized, not to the detriment of the people I've worked with, but to my own detriment, that I was sometimes a little bit too quick to go with my gut and go, "Yeah, this person will be great." And also, I was very good at empowering people, but almost to the point of abdication. And I was also at the time very much cash rich, time poor. And therefore I was prepared to throw money at an issue to get things off the ground, to get sorted. But I didn't actually have enough time to be with people and to make very clear what I actually expected. So I was too big picture, too encouraging, too taken in by people's personality and confidence. And I don't think I was really clear on what success looked like and what my expectations were. Big lessons for me.
I think whenever you're looking to work with anyone, particularly you get on well with that, clarity up front, and you talk about expectations, setting those expectations up front is so important. And I think 100%. Many of us have been there. Okay, and to finish off with, you're a prolific author, but which books inspire you, which podcasts, which talks, which are the ones that you would recommend other people check out?
Okay, one that really helped me in the early days was I don't think he's got it anymore, but Peter Thompson had this thing called the Achiever's Edge, and
Yes.
I consumed that big time. And I suppose it really, like my car became a university on wheels, as Zig Ziglar would have said. I think now various podcasts that I listen to, Feel Better, Live More, Rangan Chatterjee, I would definitely like that. I like the High Performance podcast
Yeah.
with my mate, Professor Damien Hughes and Jake Humphrey. I also like Simon Mundy's podcast, which is called Don't Tell Me the Score. But I would just say, just above all, manage your mental diet, folks. Find out what works for you, because if I'm not careful, I consume a lot of podcasts related to my area of sort of like, specialism. And I think it's good to mix it. Tim Lovejoy, what I love about Tim is he has a whole range of guests. It's not just like he has a theme, which often you'll find with certain podcasts as a theme. He talks to some weird people, including my good self. Do you know what else I like about Tim Lovejoy? You don't have to be a flipping celebrity to get on his show. And I love that about him. He's kind of like, given me a number of opportunities. And so Tim Lovejoy is also definitely worth checking out. But the main thing is start listening to stuff, folks. Manage your mental diet, stuff that makes you laugh, makes you think, or inspires you in some way. You'll find what works for you. Just make sure it does work for you.
Tim Lovejoy's interview with you is a great listen. So if people have enjoyed this and Monday's show, that's great further listening. I'm also a big fan of Simon Monday's podcast. You shared a story on the Monday podcast that came straight from that, and I'm trying to remember which one it was now. But there was something you said that I thought you heard that on Don't Tell Me the Score, because I listened to the same episode. And Damien Hughes his podcast is excellent, and he's agreed to come on to the Connected Leadership podcast.
Oh, brilliant. Pass on my regards. And in fact, Damien is one of the people that's endorsed the Happiness Revolution book as well.
Yeah, brilliant. And he's featured in Just Ask as well. Very, very insightful guy. As are you, Paul, as ever.
Thank you very much, sir.
Really appreciate your time. And I think there's been so much across the two conversations that people can take away and will make a concrete difference to how they approach. In this episode, their professional relationships, and in Monday's episode, their happiness. So thank you very much for joining me.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much, Andy. Up the ticks.
Up the ticks. Jeff says, awesome. Thank you. Enjoy your weekend. Thank you for joining us, Jeff. Paul's book is The Happiness Revolution. It's coming out in June. I think it should be available to pre-order now, so please do check that out. I've started reading it. I've read about a third of it. It's a really excellent read. As I said at the very top, it's got that humour in it that makes Paul's book so readable, but there's so much else to take away in terms of insights and knowledge as well. Thank you very much for joining us on an almost trouble-free live broadcast of the Connected Leadership podcast. I'm not sure when our next live broadcast is, but I will be back again soon. We're going to take a break from the podcasts for the first 3 weeks of May. But you'll probably still see some LinkedIn, YouTube and Facebook lives in that time as I sort of get a bit of a backlog ready for when we go back live again. Guy, really good to see you. Thanks for joining us. And, well, keep your eyes open for future ones. Having stumbled upon this one, keep your eyes open for future editions. And I'll see you again soon on the Connected Leadership podcast.